is a video series about people who are fearlessly fighting the language barriers for their companies and customers. Many people have gone before them over the millennia of human civilization. The stories are sometimes heroic, but oftentimes end in lost fortunes. This time though, it's different. The technology is ready. Nobody needs to suffer from the foreign language barrier any longer. The world is becoming massively multilingual. Let's talk with the gurus who make this happen.
So let's move on and talk a little bit about the data side. It's interesting, and you remember that, I think, from TAUS conferences here, we often ask that question when the MT gurus are on stage. So tell us, machine translation, neural machine translation, is a simple sum of data and algorithms or models. Which one of the two is more important? And consistently we get this answer: the data. The data is more important. Also noticed this in a video recently that I was trying to watch. It's very academic. You probably would follow every bit of it. From Hugging Face, Clément Delangue, who's really teaching everybody about all of the parameters in the models and all of the latest research being applied. And then he sighs and he says, but at the end of the day, more data outperforms smarter models. Yeah. So data is always making a bigger difference in the mix. So what's your view on that, and specifically how do you use data in your real-time adaptive MT setup?
Well, data is really important, but the rapid and amazing advance in machine translation quality that we've witnessed over the last 5 years has not been from data, it's been from algorithms and technology. So both of them are really important. You know, if you don't have a good data set, then there's no point in inventing a fancy algorithm to learn from it. But we have seen a dramatic improvement in the ability to leverage examples in order to do something new. You know,
but wasn't that the one-time sort of generation change from statistical to neural, or is that? I mean, now that we're all on the neural generation, the sort of next waves of improvement, do they still come from algorithms and modeling, or is the main improvement coming from the data side? And
they do. I mean, in 2015, neural machine translation was just at parity with statistical machine translation. It was barely better. And then every year since then, there's been a new high watermark that comes from algorithms. Now, improvements in data can also lead to massive changes. And what's different now than where we used to be in the statistical era is that small amounts of highly relevant data are critical to reaching very high performance. Whereas once upon a time, 2014, it was just get as much data as you can, and that really determines the quality of your system. Now we're focused on adapting to examples, even a few of them within the same document, or a slightly larger amount within the same project or organization or client. And the gains that you get from adapting to a small amount of highly relevant examples are as larger than the gains you get from everything that's happened with the core technology in the last 5 years. I mean, it's amazing how much better the system is if you can just train it on a few highly relevant examples. So for that reason, I'd say data is absolutely critical. And having some huge translation memory that's a mess is not helpful. What you want is really nice examples of here's how we want this text translated in order to capture the nuance of the project or the client.
Yeah, I'll add 2 points to that. The first is I think that these new, well, really since 2015, as John has said, these new these new neural architectures for machine translation, they're just a lot better models of language. they can condition on a lot more information when they make predictions. First, conditioning on a larger window of context than just the past 4 target words, which was, sort of the big feature in statistical systems was the language model, and it was like a 5-gram language model, and you could condition on the whole prediction history, and then you could also condition on the source sentence, which there was no really good way to do that in a statistical system. And now you can condition on an entire document context, which really that was unwieldy to try to think about in a statistical system. So they're just a whole lot better models of language. The second thing is there's some customers recently that we've started working with where their translation memories actually make the systems worse because they just haven't been curated especially well over time. Partly, not being curated and sort of segmented very well, but partly that companies, their style guidelines and the way that they write things changes over time. And so if you have a translation memory that has data over a 20-year period, then there's going to be lots of different linguistic precedents in the data. And because it's such a good model of language, it's sensitive to that. And so it will learn what's in there. And as we have found with a couple of customers recently, that actually makes predictions worse for the current type of content that they're working on than just a baseline MT system.
So there is a need to clean the data, to curate the data, to polish the data, so to say. Yeah.
What we found is that data that's generated through working on the Lilt platform, which we adapt to, always helps, and sometimes helps a whole lot. Whereas historical data, where people try to import kind of a large collection of text that they think is relevant and that they think was translated correctly, can be problematic. Sometimes it helps because a lot of curation has happened in the past, and sometimes it doesn't help because it's the kind of wrong kind of information for the model.
Yeah, because we've read you have sort of an approach to the data in 3 layers. You have your training, you've done training of a base engine, so to say, with generally available data. And then you try to get sort of domain-specific data. And then the 3rd layer is the real-time adaptive MT. That's the editing that the translator is doing. Is that right? These kind of 3 layers of data.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that the improvements from the last part, the real-time adaptation, are consistently large and they happen surprisingly quickly. This is something we've been studying recently in the research team, that even after 100 sentences of examples, you get significantly better machine translation quality as long as what you're translating is a coherent set of documents that are all kind of about the same thing or from the same client. And there are gains beyond that, but you can get adaptation improvements without translating tens of thousands of sentences.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. But that brings me to perhaps a bit of a provocative question, because you emphasize the human in the loop and the importance of the human brains, the human translators. But are you not, just like other sort of big tech companies, just using the humans to feed your data machine, your engines, and they do the polishing, but at some point their contribution is starting to shrink and up to a point in I don't know when in the future you don't need them at all. So now you advertise the humans in the loop, but in the end maybe you don't need them anymore because they've provided so much good input into the machine that the machine can do it themselves.
Yeah, I kind of believe the narrative that the end of the human translator is nigh less and less the more we go along.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, what companies pay for, they don't pay for the correct translation, they pay for the preferred translation. And so machine translation systems can generate correct translations more often than not for a given source sentence, or at least more often than they used to be able to do. That's not what companies are paying for. They're paying for the translation that's consistent with their tone and voice and with the particular objective that they have for publishing the information. And if anything, we see companies getting more sophisticated about that. If you think about a marketing department, they often have pretty complicated copy editing guidelines for how they write things in English. And historically, that's just gone into this sort of localization meat grinder where it then turns into French without, losing some of the investment that companies make in the original content that they authored. And I think more and more companies are wanting to have a sort of more nuance and have some of that copy editing guideline go through and be present in other languages. This is why some companies are experimenting with target language content authoring as opposed to doing localization. I don't think that's as economic a way to go about it, but I was on a call last week with a company talking about that. So the work that translators do, the extra linguistic work, we just view it as we're freeing them from some of the tedious and repetitive translation problems that they often work on and freeing them to work on some of the more complex problems. And I think the opportunities for automation within the sort of project management and the workflow management, those are a lot more straightforward to see how you would turn to automate that work than the human translator. I think the translator will be last. And I certainly don't anticipate that anytime in the near future of our company.
Good, that's good to hear. Yeah, thanks.
And no matter how good a generic machine translation system is, it's never going to have the world knowledge, the domain context, and the sophistication of a human translator. And so the human translator needs to be in control of the process, not just in the loop, but in control and have full agency to translate in the way that they want. And so when we use the term human in the loop, we mean something quite specific. It's not that that humans are using technology. It's really about artificial intelligence, machine translation, using that kind of technology, which makes predictions, which could potentially do it all, but can't do it right. And also that there's a tight loop. So someone might call post-editing human in the loop, but there's no loop.
No, that's right. Yeah.
It's just the machine translation system generates something, and the translator is no longer an author; they're an editor. Yeah. And the thing that struck me most in our early research about post-editing is how little editing happens. It's that the machine translation system influences the end result too much because people are under tight deadlines and because the interaction is so poor. Like once you delete the machine translation, then you have to start from scratch. Whereas when we build human-in-the-loop technology, we're making predictions as the translator's typing. They're in complete control over the structure of the sentence, whatever they want to say, but we're always making suggestions to try to speed them up so that if they've given enough guidance that the rest is obvious, then we'll complete it for them. They don't have to do that work. And if they're not quite sure which term to use from the term base, they don't have to go through some process to look it up. It's just there, suggested to them. But really, in our view, if you want great translations, the kind of stuff that people are going to read thousands of times and make buying decisions on, or learn how to do something, or learn how to fix something, then it's got to be not just adequate, but it's got to be right. And that means that you need to keep the human linguist as a central figure to make sure to get it right.
If you also want to break down the language barriers for your company and your customers, you need your language data to work for you. TAUS, the Language Data Network, provides data and tools for machine learning and for business intelligence.